I'm going to begin by making myself terribly unpopular with the NIDA School and its new philosophy of post-translation. And I'm going to suggest that it's a great idea, but there's a slight problem because I suspect that there is a thing called the translation form. And I'm here to convince you that this might be worth worrying about before we leap into the whatever the post is, post-translation studies era, okay? I'm going to get you to work, though. Those of you who know German, please raise your hand. Z. Good. Please translate that for me.
Translation is a form.
Very good. Well done. Any dissent? Translation is a form. Can't argue with that one. Form. What else could it be? You want to give me something else? Mode. We'd have to know more about it, wouldn't we? Unfortunately, in Walter Benjamin's classic essay, The Task of the Translator, that's it, full stop. And he was before the use of Translation in contemporary German theory, so it has to be just translation. It's not Dolmetschen, but Übersetzung, okay. Translation is a form. No problem. You've done very well. Congratulations. Spanish people. Spanish speakers, please. Wait a minute. You know the answer. Let them do some work. Esteban, have a go. Come on. Spanish speakers, raise your hand, please. Come on, you're all hiding now. Yeah. Come. The dream of reason produces monsters. Good enough? What? What's wrong? La razón. What's wrong with that?
Well, I mean, Goya was making a statement about enlightenment.
Yeah, I think so.
So, I mean, we would say it as reason, but it's also, I mean, it's the whole question of the enlightenment.
Yes.
Yes, tengo razón. Exactly the question of being right.
No. For people who don't know Spanish, tengo razón means I'm right. I have reason. So it has this almost banal everyday sense. But for Goya, here writing when he was writing, it is the Enlightenment. Reason in that classical sense of a positivist logic that will advance science. Yes. Although what if that works? Could be of interest. As Stefano realizes, the real problem is this
Sueño, which is sleep.
Sueño.
When you see it in the drawings that are connected to this you're able to see the people that are sleeping.
Okay, so it can be the dream of reason, the aspiration to reason, and this is where my aspiration comes in, or it can be the sleep of reason. When reason sleeps, monsters are produced, monsters, or the very aspiration produces monsters. That's a classical translation problem. Look, nobody had any trouble with Übersetzung, as far as I could see. Okay? Yeah. Nobody had problem with form particularly, although we want to know more about what it is, and I'm going to deal with that. And this is not working very well, is it? Razón could be a problem. This is not working well. Sueño is definitely a problem. But we didn't have problems with ist einer or el de la produce. There are lots of words in a translation that are not problematic. That's one of the things I want to get across to you, that translation, the actual act of translating, is rather uneven in its problematicity. Not everything is over the abyss of, oh dear, we don't know, we're lost. It could be so many different things. Note also, this is where I get really dirty, nobody asked me what I meant by translate. I said, please translate, and you all did it wonderfully. Nobody said, please, what for, what kind of what strategy, who's my reader, what's the scopus? No way. We know what translation is. That's why we're here, isn't it? There might be a form that was good enough for the activity we just did. Some of those who participated did in any case. There may be something in that very simple expression, translate. That is good enough. Not absolute, we can make anything complicated, but for the purpose that we had, we got there.
What about please?
Oh, please, that's just me being pseudo-polite, isn't it? What is a form? And I'm going to come to this. What do I mean by form? It's not the Platonic pure forms. I think that in our exchanges, in our actual quotidian activity, forms are being used every time we speak to simplify complex situations because they're efficient. It's a principle of efficiency. But here is a form which is trying to elaborate on what I think was happening there. I at one stage, very early on in this reflection, this is 1989, I think, or something like that, I asked myself, well, what is translation competence? What is it that a translator needs in order to do this thing that we just did? And I sort of excluded from my definition cases of terminology, cases of simple mapping. If L is the and de is of, there's not a choice to be made and therefore no real translation problem. It's a apply the glossary problem, apply the rule book, apply the grammar. That is relatively uninteresting and you don't need special skills for it. And so I suggested that the basic skill in translating is this capacity to generate alternatives. I see sueño and I know it could be sleep or dream. And then I have to choose between those alternatives very quickly. And one of the constraints of translation is that often you can only choose one. Very rarely can you use two or three, and almost never can you use all the possible alternatives. And this is where the complexity comes in. In presenting this skill, it looks deceptively naive. I was attempting to formulate what translators do without having recourse to the notion of equivalence, which was still around when I was doing this. Very early on, and I confess to those of you who are confessed deconstructionists, that my reading of Derrida was very fundamental in my intellectual development, and I would agree with anybody, there is no transcendental signified. We must have fundamental doubts about the meaning of any text, and the problem of equivalence is equivalent to what? We don't know. And if we do know, it's not really a translation problem for me, it's terminology, something else, okay? So I'm attempting to formulate a basic skill that can be at the center of any training program, if you like, if you want to build it out to a developmental model, but can think about translation as a real-world activity while accepting the absence of equivalence, while refusing that idealism. This is I wonder, let's see what happens. Yes, it's going to work. This is eye tracking, ladies and gentlemen. This is a thing that watches what the eye is doing on the computer screen. And here is a person translating. Please look at how complex and complicated it is. The eye is looping around, looking for a bit of meaning to latch onto, to put down in the bottom to translate. Got something. Oh, we've started. Excellent. I've stolen this from Arndt Jacobsen in Copenhagen, so it's a translation into Danish. I'm not worried about the Danish. I'm just worried about the complexity of the actual skill of translating. I also use this because there happens to be simultaneity. Don't let interpreters tell you that they are the only people who have simultaneity. Translators also have it, okay? Don't let anybody tell you that the translation unit is the sentence or the translation unit is the phrase. No way. People are jumping around between all kinds of translation units. That complexity has to be respected and investigated. I'm very, very interested in the cognitive research that's being done. We're learning a lot about that kind of process from eye tracking, but also simple screen recording that's being done. Think about what it is to take that, I've done a loop, dear me. To take that process in its complexity and reduce it to the formal definition that I presented. Nobody is pretending that my two-part definition replaces that complexity. But it makes it into a form that can be used as a point for reflection on training and theorizing. We can talk about equivalence and the alternatives to equivalence in relation to that form. That's the sort of thing I mean by form. It means doing intellectual work and applying reason in the Enlightenment sense. And many of us do it without knowing. Here is another bit of reason in the post-Enlightenment sense. Don't do this in your class. That means don't cite translate Walter Benjamin in front of a whole lot of PhDs. The French word, no, the German word Brot, meaning bread, and pain, French for bread, mean the same thing. However, the way in which they mean it does not mean the same thing. It's not the same thing. The way of the meaning lies in the fact that the two words, from the French and from the German, signify something different. And they cannot be exchanged with each other. Okay, you've got good German rye bread, heavy, nutritious, and you've got the light French baguette. That the same word bread means bread, but it doesn't mean the same thing in the different cultures. They cannot be exchanged with each other, and ultimately they strive to exclude each other. Ours is the good bread, yours is the too light bread, yours is the heavy bread, ours is, okay. We get this competition between languages and cultures, this border between the two. And most readings of Benjamin sort of stop there. The fact of difference, the struggle over difference. And indeed, from that point, the Aufgabe des Übersetzers, the task of the translator, becomes a reflection on languages and the relation between languages, with actually very little to say about the act of translating, which is what I'm most interested in, except for this passage. But then Benjamin goes on and says, taken in the absolute, however, they do signify one and the same thing. And I'm waiting and say, well, wait a minute. They signify different things, bedeuten, and then in the absolute, they mean one and the same thing. And I think here I'm getting to a very common form of translation, that when we try to say what translation is, and we do it in a form, there is a whole string of theorizing that revolves around the paradox, the same and the other, basically, the same yet different. Or as Roman Jakobson put it, the central problem, he said, of linguistics, but it could be of translation theory, is to explain the difference in sameness. Now, that sort of paradox can keep American theorists alive for about 50 years, or has been since this was published in 1923. It's lots and lots of readings of Walter Benjamin's essay. I want to do something quite rude with it. That's all your bread. Lots of different bread, okay? So I just did some Google images this morning. There is a complexity in bread. I know Michael Cronin gives a wonderful talk on all the different cheeses in Europe, and that the linguistic diversity is no less than the diversity of cheeses. You could say the same for bread. Actually, near Göttingen in Germany, there is a bread museum, if you're really into it. But, Walter Benjamin's essay, and this is where I opt for an empiricist position. Part of the Enlightenment is also empiricism. I want to go out and not taste all the bread. I want to think about what Benjamin was talking about. His essay was written as a preface to his translations of Baudelaire's Tableau Parisien, which is part of Les Fleurs du Mal. So I went to Les Fleurs du Mal, and I looked for bread, pain. It only occurs twice. One is in La Muse Vénale, where we get the expression, pour gagner ton pain de chaque soir, to gain your evening bread, which is an allusion to the Christian expression, gagner ton pain quotidien, to earn your daily bread. The bread in question, as you'll see in these images from Google, has already been translated by a well-known institution called the Christian Church. That Benjamin, as a translator, was not confronting the thing bread, was not confronting the word pain. He was confronting something that is already translated into French and German and any other culture that uses the Bible, as these images suggest. The same is true, remarkably, for the second appearance in Les Fleurs du Mal, the poem La Bénédiction, where the poète maudit, the decadent poet, gives his benediction to God. It's a nice text. Anyway, le pain, le vin destiné à sa bouche. The bread and wine destined to his mouth. La Bénédiction. Again, a Christian reference. You never take it in the absolute. Absolute genommen. You're never in the absolute. You're never the first one on that border. That border has always been crisscrossed by many people before. And in this case, that absolute confrontation, that absolute paradox that appears in the form in the theoretical text has been pre-translated by a cross-cultural institution, done for them. It's not a confrontation with the absolute. Somebody got there first. Okay? Now, that's just to illustrate how I want to approach this problem of forms, by looking at what's actually done rather than the ideas about absolute divisions or paradoxes, and to get information and orientation from the actual practice of people. In this case, the practice of translating Les Fleurs du Mal, which in the end is not all that difficult. Forms are part of what Popper calls third world. That is, constructs of the mind, products of the mind that operate in social life, like a text. Popper makes a simple point that the book is not a text, the text is something that's in the books, but they are objects that have a force and a changing capacity in the world. These are third world. These are forms belong to that particular kind of existence. As I said, they are things that reduce complexity, and that's absolutely important for translators, since they seek to gain trust, but I won't go into that just now. Forms can be found in many, many spheres of life. Money. Money. I haven't got any. I've got some coins, but... money has currency, has value that changes. It's not fixed. But we exchange it as if it were fixed. We know it's far more complex. People in Greece, Spain, and Italy know it's far more complex at the moment. But we proceed in our life as if that money were real value. And any economist will tell you that there's not gold enough in the world to back up. You know, it's a promissory note saying, I will give you this amount in gold originally for most currencies. There's not enough gold around. We're operating on an illusion, ladies and gentlemen. And as long as we keep believing it, it works. Equivalence is actually quite similar to money in that respect. Okay? If it gets too far away from any exact reality, the economic system will fall down, as will any translational system. But in the meantime, the forms are good enough to keep us going. Okay? But you can go through other systems. I put religion there. The academy, the fact that we tend to believe there is such a thing as a field. We talk as if there were such things as disciplines. These are forms, ladies and gentlemen. Mutable, changeable, historical, but nevertheless useful. And we use them. Why should we raise questions about translation if we don't raise questions about all these things? I'm not going to go through some serious attempts that have been made to understand a thing that might be the translation form, to recognize that out there in social life, there is something there, and we want to try to pin it down, describe, define. And I'm going to go through several inadequate ways, and I'll explain my own inadequate way. Okay? Here is one. As is well known, Gideon Turi in 1995, started to use the term, started earlier, but anyway, in his book, he elaborated the term assumed translation, which handles the problem in this way. Any translation, a translation is any utterance presented or regarded as such within the target culture on no matter what grounds. So he says, I'm not going to tell you what a translation is. I'm going to look around, and if somebody calls a thing a translation, then for me it's a translation, and I'm going to study it. This is the absolute descriptivist position. It's not positivistic. It's not 19th century. It's a humility. It's a moment of humility, saying, I have no idea. Let me look around and see what people call translations. Okay? And that's an initial way to solve a problem. What's wrong with that problem? What's wrong with that solution? What's wrong with that form? No, this is your big chance to be famous. Is that a good solution to the problem? Is this an adequate replacement or description of a translation form? For me, no. Why? Because different people speak different languages have different words for translation. I have to know how to map that word onto that one, and to do that I need a concept of translation. So I cannot get beyond the need to impose my concept of translation. As much as you try to get away from imposing your concept of translation, you fall into the same trap. Do you see? Do I have to elaborate? Got it? It's a logical paradox, okay, which is badly handled in this particular case. And I think Turi knew it, because in the same book, some pages later, he actually says, well, in reality, I've looked at all these words, I've looked at hundreds, thousands of translations, and I found that they all have these three things. And this is where he does impose his own view of what a translation is. And this is a description of a translation form, I think. He says, if a text is presented as a translation, people think there was a source text. They think there have been source text features transferred, and they think that there's a set of relations, that it wasn't just a random, there was a mapping process of some kind going from one to the other. And he says, when people assume a text is a translation, this is what they assume. And that is the translation form. That's getting better for me. You avoid the logical paradox. Note, however, the form only exists in the moment of reception. We've moved from my definition, which was the moment of production, of competence. Now we've got the person on the outside looking at a translation. The form only operates in the target culture, as if translations were not also retroactively operative in source cultures and intermediary cultures. It's never just an affair of two. Okay, that's enough. I don't have to go further, do I, on that? And it's also got three. If I can reduce it to two, it's a bit more elegant as far as definitions go. Okay. The beauty of the definition, though, was that it allowed for pseudo-translations to be in the corpus. I'm going to look at translations. Any text presented as a translation is worthy of my best attentions, including pseudo-translations. That is, a text for which there was no source. I invented this text, often in situations of political repression or radically new knowledge that is considered dangerous. You find an abundance of pseudo-translations. 12th, 13th century Hispania, we have lots of them. This is my translation from Arabic. It wasn't. It was an original creation. But then when the church came along and said, wait a minute, I'm just a translator. I got it from that guy over there. And people could avoid persecution and present innovative ideas in the guise of translations. That's in there. Because the translation form, and this is Turi's real contribution in my sense, he realized that there is a form of translation which can lie. The translation form is there because it arouses these suppositions, these assumptions, even when they're not true. Pseudo-translations become, to me, a supreme test of the existence of a translation form. If there were no translation form, there would be no pseudo-translations. Many of you have become interested in relevance theory and its possible applications to translation, so I'm looking here at Ernst August Gut, who handles the same problem in a slightly different way. He's a bit sneakier. He divides up the realm of possible texts by getting rid of things he's not interested in. As you remember, he says, well, there are overt versus covert translations. A covert translation is a text like publicity that may or may not be a translation. It doesn't have to be. I'm interested in the overt ones, that is, the ones that declare their relation to an anterior text. So get rid of half of the world of translations. And then within overt, there's direct versus indirect, and he's interested in the direct ones, the ones where the mapping operation explicitly makes reference to a source, okay? And then for the direct overt translations, that is this quarter that is left, he says in quite Turi-like mode, the translation creates a presumption of complete interpretative resemblance. That is, again, the form exists in the moment of reception, not in production, not in distribution either, I might add. And he's saying that whenever anybody gets a text that fulfills these criteria, overt, direct, I'm not going to go into the details of the definition, that person makes an assumption, Turi's term again, that there is complete interpretative resemblance. And Gut has a very pessimistic, very pessimistic view of language as a set of inadequate clues, and so this assumption is almost always condemned to the status of a lie, which is a rather unhappy place to leave it. Neither Turi nor Gut really question the cultural specificity of these assumptions. They do, in effect, assume the existence of a translation form to which they have some kind of private, secret, infallible access. But they might be right. Sandra Halvorsen has dealt with these problems, and she's noticed that many of the approaches, the theoretical approaches, assume that translation is a prototype. That is, in the way that Gut gets rid of the external, less translational translations to get to this hardcore and then defines that. Also Turi as well, recognizing the whole field, but there is the assumption that the pseudo is not quite the real thing because that distinction is still operative. Halvorsen suggests that the translation concept, wherever it may be, is operating in a prototypical way.